Like I don't think the bishop would have said that like, don't dig, put it on your shelf. I don't think he would have said that in like a somewhat threatening voice. I think he would have tried to be like uber friendly with that. Like, I just put that kind of thing on the shelf, and you know, I think it would have been much more folksy and Mr. Rogers.
It'll make sense someday.
Yeah, I just have faith in the, you know, in the prophet and the current leader of the church that they won't lead the church astray. But it wouldn't have sounded like scoldy or finger waggy. But that makes for better drama. So totally fine. We'll start the live stream going pretty soon, but I don't think we'll start talking until 10.
Do you do the Bible TikToks?
I do.
Oh, okay, I've seen a handful of them circling through. Okay, cool.
That's for Dan, yeah.
What? That's a fun little niche market,
isn't it?
I knew Dan before he was TikTok famous.
Oh yeah.
Hey everybody, we're going to get started in a few minutes. We're just getting everything set up, and some people are coming in, so grab a Coke and a smile and we'll be back. Yeah.
I also realized today one of my
When I'm live streaming this on Instagram, do I want it to be story or post?
I had no idea.
Shoot, I wonder if Esther's reachable.
I don't know. Is anyone here more Gen Z than I
Usually
am?
it's a story,
Yeah, I would
because
say
they would
story
click
is
on it on the story video to go live.
Okay, so I should keep it story probably.
Yeah, and you can save it off your story later, I think.
Oh, we want it to be savable, so
I'm
that's.
not positive about that part, but I'm positive about what it
You
told
should
me.
be able to highlight, right?
You could at least do a highlight.
Okay,
And that would save it.
and then Dan's streaming it to his YouTube, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we are live right
I
now.
still use Instagram like it's 2012. I don't know any of the new fancy bells and whistles. I know how to post stuff. That's about it.
Esther knows so much more about it than I do. She's like figured out how to make our account so much more effective.
Right? Okay, I just want to make sure I have it right.
No
Okay,
worries.
cool. Just want to go climb that wall.
Looks like a rock climbing wall.
Yeah.
Want to see the water when it comes down? Oh, do they? Oh, I guess it looks like it was the moon. Once upon a time.
Is this a real water feature, Brad?
It is actually, yeah. I don't ever run it as one, but
That's cool.
it sort of trickles though. It's not like heavy duty, but I just like being able to control the humidity in here a little bit better. There've been a couple of shows where the artist like wanted it on though.
For the sound?
I don't know, just the ambience or something. I don't know. Ironically, it's really ugly. But.
It's a remnant from the Chinese restaurant, right?
I think it was. I think before it was a Chinese restaurant. I think it was like a sort of generic seafood themed restaurant.
Oh,
It had
okay.
like pirate. Like I think that's where the rope on the bandages
Oh,
and stuff
like
came
a
from.
like a seafood
Yeah.
piratey type place.
I think that's what it was. Like way back, like 40,
Yeah.
45 years ago, like in
I
the
get it,
70s,
you know.
80s. Somebody came through here not that long ago, who was like 20 years older than me, and he was like, I remember being in here in 1976, and this is what it was.
Oh, that's
Wow.
cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
It definitely looks like it could be from the 70s.
And it was connected to the place next door, like the doors behind these panels and the nook in the front's a sort of filled in doorway.
Oh, so it was like one big restaurant.
It was bigger than this, yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay, I'm gonna hit record here, but we're gonna wait just a few more minutes. We're telling your followers that you started a live video. Okay. Also, I think because we're doing just one episode instead of two tonight, it's not gonna go even as long as last time, probably. We gotta turn on the mics. Testing.
Also testing.
Yeah, I think it's good. Pull this up here, and then we'll give it maybe 5 more minutes before we start yapping. You think I should flip the sign when we start?
A lot of people came in last time. I don't know if you don't want them to.
Yeah, that's the thing. I do want people to know that it's happening to show up. I just don't want random people off the street coming in and wanting to buy stuff up front. Basically, like, I don't want to sell shit tonight. take your money elsewhere. And it'd be a little easier when Esther's here because she could pop up there and talk to somebody. But
Run interference for you.
run interference, yeah, or even sell something.
Okay, would it be paid?
If you guys are interested, we're starting an event back here in a couple minutes. Okay, I think we should get going. We're going to try to keep things a little more abbreviated tonight. Just in part, there's only one episode to discuss. I think there's a lot to discuss. We could, Dan and I could drone on endlessly. But you know, we don't need to get ahead of ourselves as well. There's still a lot of the show. We could speculate about what we see is coming, but there's, you know, we're planning on talking about some of the stuff that is really important context for like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but pretty sure we're going to see some Mountain Meadows in coming episodes, so we can kind of table some of that. This week, I want to thank Dan for being here again, for being willing to be a part of this, and quite frankly for the audience he brings. You know, people that are genuinely interested in serious discussions about all kinds of stuff related to religion. And they're going to get the reward tonight. Last week, I started things off by with a little bit of a conceptual discussion. I even like literally had a whiteboard. No whiteboard today. But we're going to flip that script this time. Dan's going to start out with a little bit of kind of headier stuff coming out of his background in cognitive linguistics and how cognitive linguistics relates to things like religion and religious faith. And then we're gonna talk a little bit about my dissertation, really only because my dissertation is about the LDS Temple and about taboos around the LDS Temple and about respecting taboos around the LDS Temple. So it'd be kind of dumb for me not to at least gesture toward that with this recent episode. And then we'll spend some time talking about a couple of specific things from the episode as well. But I'm guessing we'll be at least 20, 30 minutes shorter this time than we were last time. So I'm just going to give the floor to Dan, and hopefully I'm actually going to learn something too from this.
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the venue and all of you for coming out, and everybody who's joining us online, whether it's Instagram or YouTube. Those are the two that we're using, right?
That's the two we're using right now, yeah.
Okay. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about essentialism, and that's kind of a $2 word in a lot of context. But we talked a little bit last time about signs and the signified. And an assumption that a lot of folks make when we talk about language, when we talk about social identities, when we talk about symbols, is that there is inherent meaning, that there is some kind of essence to our language and our, how dare you? And I want to talk about why that can be problematic. But I want to start with the word furniture. Everybody in here is probably pretty confident in their ability to distinguish furniture from not furniture. Is that a good assumption to make?
By the way, everything in the universe is literally furniture or not furniture.
Yes. Just as with, I didn't want to go the potato route tonight, but can anybody tell me what the definition of furniture is and what dictionary contains that definition of furniture? Can anybody tell me a definition of furniture? No, you don't carry around a definition of furniture in your head.
Which is weird because it means that you're proficient in using a word confidently and knowing what it means without actually being able to define it. It turns out this is true of almost all of our words.
In fact, I have made the argument a number of times on TikTok and annoyed a lot of people doing it, that dictionary definitions distort more than they clarify. They are primarily used for people to draw boundaries around concepts, primarily to serve some kind of rhetorical goal. And so I want to talk a little bit about...
And you can see that, by the way, because very often in like lively discussions, internet, otherwise, people weaponize dictionary definitions and say, look, this is the dictionary definition of X, Y, or Z, of, you know, you can't define a woman. You know? yeah. But there are a number of things that
trying to define them distorts them. In fact, there's a famous Supreme Court case, I don't know if anybody recalls this, that had to do with whether or not a specific movie was hardcore pornography. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said, I may not be able to define it, but I know it when I see it. And this is not that. And there's a reason.
And that wasn't a cop-out either.
No, that was the foundation of a Supreme Court ruling. And there is something to that. We have intuitive categories in our minds that are created not by our understanding of any kind of necessary and sufficient features that define a category or an entity or a concept, but because from the moment we open our eyes and begin to hear things, our brains are making connections. And
To other things.
yeah, when my daughters learned to speak, they didn't come to me with an apple and say, what are the necessary and sufficient features of an apple, Daddy? They said, apple? I said, yeah, that's an apple. And then they said, apple? No, not an apple. Apple? Yeah, that's an apple. And
But you know what's really even more important than this not being an apple is a potato not being one. Or an orange. I mean, I don't mean that
Yeah.
it's a joke, but like things that are apple-like but are still not apples.
And what's going on is as they're gaining all this experience, seeing what is labeled an apple and what is not labeled an apple, unbeknownst to them, their brains are making connections and creating a constellation of relationships that they are going to use throughout their life to be able to intuitively, automatically, rapidly identify things.
And these relationships are not between words and the things they represent. They're between words and other words.
And these are usually they're a perception of some kind of similarity, be it shape, color, function, maybe some kind of essence that is associated with it. But when we think about words and concepts that we use, we don't use necessary and sufficient features. We use these intuitive relationships that our minds have created without our permission.
And we can see ourselves doing this regularly, actually. So the example I use with my students is, it's a word on the tip of my tongue. It's not galaxy. It's not volcano. It's not justice. It's not carpet. Crap, what is it? Right? That does nothing for you, right? I mean, it is literally none of those things, the word I'm sort of groping for right now. But that's not how we do this. We say, it's not wolf, it's not dingo, it's not coyote, it's not cat, it's not fox, it's not puppy, what is it? Oh, it's dog. That's right, it's dog. Right? When you're reaching, when you lose a word, it's the things that are closest to it where you're trying to find it, because you're trying to find it in that sort of constellation-like space that Dan's describing.
Yeah. And when we create these categories, they don't have boundaries, because boundaries are not inherent or natural. They just kind of radiate out toward the periphery where things are debatable or they overlap with other categories. And what definitions do is we started getting excited about definitions with the Renaissance because we rediscovered Aristotle. And Aristotle talks a lot about essences and things like this.
And categories, like everything in the world is describable in terms of a finite number of categories.
Right, and it's binary yes, no, member, not member, sets of features. And so we've decided, well, this is how we're going to understand language. So every word, every concept, every category. If I asked you to define furniture, what would you do? What would the process in your head be? You would think of everything that you've ever seen labeled furniture, and then you would try to find some kind of
common
short list of features that are shared by all of them. The problem is there is no short list of features. It doesn't exist because the category did not form around any set of features. It starts from the idea that certain things are furnishings or furnish a room, and if they didn't have other categories that they belong to, they became furniture. And we know what furniture is because we've spent a lifetime seeing people say furniture.
Is this furniture?
And if you look it up in the dictionary, you're going to get one of two different general definitions. One of them is going to say movable articles, whether useful or ornamental, for making a public space or a room or a building or a business functional, something like that. The main difference between dictionaries is going to be whether or not they say it has to be a large movable article. And so if you bolt down a bookshelf, does it stop being furniture? If you, a gun safe, that's pretty darn big, but has anyone ever called that furniture? Your refrigerator, your microwave? That definition.
What's the difference between furniture and an appliance?
Yeah, this belongs to another category. We don't call that furniture. But somebody will say, well, technically it's furniture. But all that means is I'm taking the definition and considering that authoritative, not our usage. But what are dictionary definitions supposed to do? They're supposed to capture usage. They're supposed to follow after and describe usage. So in short, reducing conceptual categories to necessary and sufficient features is a relic of the Renaissance and our adoption of Aristotelian categorization that fundamentally distorts conceptual categories. That is, categories that are not found in nature but are things that we create through our discourse, conversation. Yeah.
So that reminds me, there's a famous conceptual artist named Joseph Kossuth. In like the 60s, he made this art piece where there's like a physical wooden chair, and then there's a photograph of the chair on the wall next to it, and then on the opposite side there's like the definition of a chair hanging on the wall. So like when you interact with it, it's supposed to make you think about like what actually is a chair and which one of these things is capturing what a chair really is.
Yeah.
So that just your conversation there is reminding me.
And that goes back to like Plato's concept of forms, that everything participates in some. So there's some chairness out there, and
Chairness as an ideal.
Yeah,
exists.
and these things are just approximating this ideal.
If they exemplify enough of the features of the ideal, then they are a token of the type.
Yeah. And so when we get into things beyond language, we extend this to social identities, we extend this to nations, to language, to all these kinds of things. Rhetorically, it is helpful for us to reduce things to definitions because it allows us to draw boundaries around things.
And then to group things that we do that to into larger groups. So you keep using the word categorization. Now, technically, chair is a categorical term, but it's one that can also be lumped in with other chair-like things that aren't chairs, as furniture or as, like, do these things all belong into this category? There's and then categories can be lumped into larger categories. It can be like language, just the way that we intuitively use it resembles what we call taxonomy a lot, right? Groupings of things according to how similar they are, and then groupings of things into sort of higher order groups. But that almost always just involves, like when it comes to like a natural taxonomy, like a biological taxonomy, we tend to think to ourselves, oh, well, like all we're doing is just describing the world the way that it is by saying that these species belong in this genus and that these genuses belong in this family is after genus, right? In any case, what's really happening is like the higher up you get, the more it's just about choices that researchers and scientists are making, saying we're going to say that for these reasons, we're going to lump these things into into the same category. Whereas if we had chosen different reasons, we could lump them in with something else. We could draw the boundaries differently, and they're just useful for talking, which is really all any words are.
And what I'm trying to drive at is that we frequently in discussions and particularly debates, we frequently retreat to essentialism, which is the assumption that the things we're talking about, the categories, the groups, the identities, all have some kind of essence. And I wrote a master's thesis in my doctoral dissertation on how people anciently conceptualized deity. And when we talk about religion today, we tend to center deity, but if you ask people to define deity, they're going to use whatever essentialism serves their own interests, their rhetorical goals, their identity politics, whatever. But the study of religion has been for many, many years finding out that you can't really drill down to the foundation of this, because all you get is more identity politics and more structuring power.
You think about any term that we use, and we can even stick kind of vaguely in like the religious realm here, but like any term that we use where it's a category term, we're describing something that humans do, and there are different versions of the thing. Those things are very, very hard to define. What is deity? What is worship? What is ritual? What is religion? What is community? Like these are all words that are very, very, very difficult to define. We're comfortable using them. We know which slots in the sentence they go into. And when somebody uses the word, it's not confusing to us. Unless they use it in an unorthodox way, right? And that's not ironic. Describing, for example, something with the word religion that you wouldn't typically say is religion. Like, I don't know, what are some Scientology religion? Is so when you get an umbrella term, a categorical term like religion, you run into the same problem that Dan's describing earlier, where we intuitively know a whole bunch of things that we think belong to that category and other things that we don't think belong to that category. Is there some list of necessary and sufficient features that all those things have that are therefore the essence of a thing, of a naturally occurring real thing in the world called religion? Or is religion a category like species that's kind of like a natural category, or is it more of a man-made category?
And so we'll talk once we get closer to the end of this series more about religion and what the conceptualization of religion seems to be that is being presented by this series. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is, in light of the fact that all of our understandings are built up by our own experiences, words, texts, concepts, identities have no inherent meaning. And this is, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's just interesting to me that we're taking this back to Aristotle, because in my study of developmental psychology, I'm just this whole time sitting here thinking, oh, this is assimilation, this is accommodation. If everyone knows kind of what that is, it's just exactly what you're describing.
Yeah.
And that is a very unique experience that each child goes through their lifespan based on other developmental features
Yeah.
of their life.
And so everybody's experiences are different. And so while we usually have enough of an overlap to be able to communicate, and school and media and things like that generate some normativity to a lot of this, there are differences. If I stop somebody on the street in San Antonio and ask them to describe in as much detail as possible a boot, what are they going to describe? A cowboy boot. If I do the same thing in Liverpool, they're going to describe an army boot, if not the trunk of a car, because they use.
Or if you do it at Solitude, and they're going to describe ski boots,
right? Yeah, ski boots. So it all depends on context, and it all depends on experiences. And what I'm getting at is that one of the things that does not have inherent meaning, but we generate meaning based on the frameworks, the interpretive lenses that we bring to it that have been created by our own experiences, are things like scripture, for LDS people, temple worship. There is no prescribed meaning for every syllable of the scriptures, or what goes on in the temple, or what goes on in a sacrament meeting, or family prayer, or anything like that. These are ways that people share experiences and understandings, and frequently misunderstandings based on their own backgrounds, because none of this is, it should not be essentialized. It changes from time to time, from place to place, from person to person, which is one of the reasons that Latter-day Saints like their patriarchal blessings, because they change throughout our lives, because the interpretive lenses and the experiences that we accumulate over the years help us read it in different ways and understand it in different ways.
And that flexibility, by the way, is a tremendous source of power, because if you can actually generate widely shared meanings in a context where meanings aren't just completely self-evident,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's very, very powerful. It's way more powerful for people to share some sense of what something means when it is in fact like significantly subject to the dynamics that you're describing than when people share the same sense of what the word dog means.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And just thinking about that, like in terms of our church, I feel like the word doctrine is a huge issue right now because we're always
Yeah.
talking about like doctrine doesn't change, but there's also not really a definition of what is doctrine. So everyone's like, oh,
Right.
the doctrine of the church doesn't say this, but then somebody else says, yes, it definitely does. And I mean, and it doesn't change, but what is it? And that's super important right now, I feel like.
Yeah, and it's because we want it to be reducible to boundaries. We want to be able to draw clear lines around it and say this is 100% in, this is 100% out. But that's just not the way the concept works, except when somebody wants to say this is definitely in and this is definitely out, at which point usually you appeal to authority or you appeal to some kind of definition, some essentialization.
And it's usually being weaponized in
Yeah.
a polemical context, again, like saying, well, the dictionary definition of this is this, and so, like, you're wrong and I'm right.
And you can say, well, what dictionary? They define things differently. We had another comment.
Yeah, just to me, I remember a talk, I think Elder Holland gave it a long time ago about how, like, the doctrine of the church isn't the cafeteria, you can't pick and choose, but then interpretation is so much and everything is so personal, so based off of what you were saying, I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, I angered a lot of people a few months ago when I said Mormonism is cafeteria Mormonism, because when we go, and this is going to overlap with what's going on in Under the Banner of Heaven. When we go back and look at stuff that we don't hold to anymore, for many people in the 19th century, that was doctrine. And so it's a different time, it's a different place, it's different people. And when you go around the world and see how people live Mormonism, it is different from time to time and place to place. And so what the kinds of arguments that are being made in Under the Banner of Heaven are things that frequently are going to rely on essentialism. The notion that something is inherent, innate, or essential to a given text, a given practice, a given liturgy,
A given idea, a given word.
a given social group, a given movement. Yeah, there are a lot of ways that essentialism is being presupposed in the arguments that are being made in this text. And I think temple worship is a good example of where there is not a lot of meaning that is prescribed. There's a lot of things that are being said. There's a lot of symbolism. There's a lot of imagery. But for the most part, it's left to the participant to make meaning however they want, in a way that's going to inform their experiences.
And this is a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. And this is
as intended.
yeah, and this is what makes it dynamic. It's what makes it so somebody experiencing a specific problem in one part of the world can find answers in the temple, and somebody experiencing something completely different can find answers in the same imagery and the same symbolism and the same words. And the same is true of the scriptures. We want to think that everything is reducible to a single intended meaning, and it's really not. And the scriptures would be boring and meaningless if everything was reducible to a single meaning. People get meaning out of them and make meaning with them precisely because they are flexible, and that is a feature of Scripture.
And then in the context of a huge variety of possible meanings, again, a shared, relatively agreed upon meaning is all the more powerful.
Yeah.
Precisely because it doesn't have to be, it's not forced to be that just by the language or the text itself.
Yeah, and those things will change. Even the authoritative meanings will change. Isaiah 2, I forgot Isaiah 2. The mountain of
How beautiful.
the mountain of the Lord's house will be established on the top of the mountains, and all people will flow into it. What is that a reference to for contemporary Latter-day Saints?
Salt Lake Temple, for sure, yeah.
Okay, so what did it mean for the 2,600 years before the Salt Lake Temple was built. It meant Jerusalem.
It meant Jerusalem.
What did it mean for Latter-day Saints before we moved to the Salt Lake Valley? It meant Jerusalem and Zion, wherever Zion happened to be located.
Which for a certain time period, it definitely meant Jerusalem and Jackson County.
Yeah. And so with the changing sets of experiences, the authoritative meaning of these texts changes. And then President Hinckley, what did he say in 2002 that it meant? He said, well, the Olympics was a partial fulfillment of what was going on in Isaiah 2. So what's that?
Really?
Well, there was
He did? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was a general conference talk where he said this is one way to understand this,
Okay.
the fulfillment of this
All right.
of this text. And what that does is that makes it more meaningful to people because they can say, I participated in a partial fulfillment of this prophecy that took place over 2,600 years ago. And that makes it personal and it makes you part of the narrative, and you can find your own experiences in the relationship between God and their people that is being represented in the text, and that makes the scriptures more powerful for people. So this is a feature of text. This is why the Constitution cannot be reduced to any single meaning. It is why Heller in 2008 is a laughable misunderstanding of the Constitution up until about the mid-70s. The meaning that Heller asserted simply did not exist until the mid-1970s because they're the authority and they had something they wanted to get out of it, and so they said this is what it means now, and for all intents and purposes
But it is what it means now.
it is what it means
In
now.
almost every meaningful sense of what it means to mean.
Yeah.
Right?
And so we don't excavate meaning from text, from symbols, from practices, from liturgy. We create meaning. And so
They still put guideposts and horizons and
Yeah.
you can't just it's not generating it out of whole cloth, right? But because that flexibility is built into it and the range of possibilities is built into it, it would be boring if everybody interpreted it the same way because there was only one way of interpreting it, and kind of boring if everybody literally interprets it differently. But man, if all the interpretations are possible and there's something like unity around one, really powerful.
And what's one of the arguments that I think was made in episode 3 of Under the Banner of Heaven by juxtaposing what's going on in the temple with what's her name? Was it Jenny's mom? Sarah. So Sarah in the back of the paddy wagon, the juxtaposition of her discussion of blood atonement
Yeah.
with what's going on in the temple is meant to say what's going on here is a reification of precisely the same thing. In other
These two are
words,
intimately connected to each
Right.
other, and that there's a historical connection that binds them.
right. And you didn't hear, I thought I remembered hearing some of the parts of that ceremony that were taken out by 1930, but I rewatched it and didn't hear that. But I think what's actually said kind of alters the significance of what was being performed. But one of the reasons I think you don't hear the altered representation of what that represents is precisely because they want to present, they want you to interpret it in line with what's going on with this discussion.
They want you to read a certain subtext into it, and very often subtexts are most powerful when you don't they're not too
It's not
sort of
explained.
ham-fisted and
Yeah.
explicit.
And so the church had renegotiated the significance of these things generations before. But the idea is there's an essence, and we're going to return to that essence because that's the true meaning. Whatever they might say, that was the original meaning, therefore the true meaning. And that is why it is popping up again in 1980 with the murder of this woman and her child, because they are reifying, they are manifesting the true meaning of these symbols.
And the idea of an essence is so important at so many with so many layers of what's happening in this series, what's being depicted in the series, what's being attempted to be depicted in the series, but also the way that we're responding to. I mean, a lot of Mormon pushback against the series, a lot of Mormon kind of like, you know, defensiveness about the series has to do with the idea that portraying a Mormon character in a certain way portrays a Mormon essence in a certain way, and that it's getting the essence wrong. We're saying this isn't how Mormon men talk, or this isn't how Mormon men do this, or this isn't how Mormon women do this. So we're appealing to the idea of an essence that's being somehow misrepresented
Right.
on the screen because it's a fight over essences.
Because our own experience is the true one.
Mm-hmm.
And what they may represent, if we don't experience it that way, then that is a false representation, even though it may resonate with many others all around the world.
Which brings us back, and so I want to kind of just briefly revisit an important point from last week, which is that more than anything else, like beyond any kind of I don't know, ideological or polemical agendas or purposes that the creator of the series has in these depictions, one of the things that is very clear is that they want to actually depict a very interesting murder mystery that like follows certain conventions in how you have a multi-episode murder mystery unfold and keep it interesting and drop shoes and you know, have reveals that cause people to and build tension and fear and stuff like that. So there are all kinds of conventions that have nothing to do with what Mormons do or don't sound like that they're having to appeal to. And they're having to have these Mormon characters animate those conventions, right? What is like the convention of a male investigator who's a good family man who's trying to keep his work at work and trying not to let the darkness of what he's encountering, investigating murders, affect his family life too much, and kind of like struggling with that balance. Like that is a well-worn stock character in our popular culture, right? How do you do a Mormon version of that? Okay? How do you make a Mormon character inhabit that stock character? And so you have sort of the level of like ethnographic particularity. This is how Mormons talk. This is how they say this. This is how Mormon men sort of like inhabit their masculinity. This is how Mormon men condescend to women, right? There are all these different sort of way. And then, you know, like you're having something that's ethnographically particular on the surface that's supposed to represent something underneath, some essence, some characterological essence, right? And Dustin Lance Black has to make this legible to outsiders. So I think that there's, you know, in a lot of cases at least, I think it's very defensible that Black is doing something that does not read at the ethnographic surface level like the correct way Mormons do X, Y, or Z. But for him, it's most important that X, Y, or Z actually get effectively communicated to outsiders, which means that when there's a tension between this is the way a Mormon would do X, this is the way a stock character would do X, you go with the stock character, it makes more sense, right? So
and the attempt to kind of mark it as Mormon anyway can come across as kind of wooden,
yeah,
and artificial, and I think that's where a lot of people are not seeing themselves.
And I think so. I think it's in a certain sense, it's like very, very defensible that Black and the directors. So Black isn't directing the episodes, I don't think. Actually, I know this episode was directed by a female director. I can't remember her name, but he's writing. They've got consultants and stuff. But when it comes down to it, there's this tension is always going to be there. Should this character do this thing, this really important thing that's about the character, like it allows you to read something deep about the character? Should this character do this in a typically Mormon way, or in a typical American television stock character way? And if it doesn't read as Mormon, then it raises the hackles of Mormon commentators, including like me. Like I was very frustrated by this in the first couple episodes because I had to really think this through in order to realize that there's something defensible about what Black's doing. The scene in the bishop's office in this episode, right? There are parts of that actually read very, very, very Mormon to me. There's a part that doesn't read especially Mormon to me, which is that when like the interview with the girls is pretty good. The tone that the bishop strikes with them, the sort of like folksy politeness, the combination of like Mr. Rogers with formality, right? Like these things read pretty spot on. But when Pyrie asks him about this dark stuff that he's been, the blood atonement, the response is this sort of, in a certain sense, it's ethnographically accurate because the metaphor of a shelf is actually something that church leaders and people in pastoral contexts have like used this metaphor as a sort of like, it's supposed to be helpful, right? But when he gets to this section where he says like, don't go digging, just kind of stick it on the shelf, have faith in the prophet, his tone is a little bit finger waggy, like a little bit almost like, I don't want to say quite threatening, but almost in that.
It's kind of ominous.
Kind of ominous, yeah.
But people who aren't Mormon and don't know anything about Mormonism need it to be ominous.
They need it. They exactly need it to be ominous. Like it works way better dramatically. Even though like probably 9 out of 10 Mormon bishops in 1980s, their tone would have been almost the opposite. They would have leaned into the folksy niceness when saying the hard thing, like, brother, I just kind of stick it on a shelf and have faith, and like it's gonna be okay. Like really turn on the charm in a way that comes across as sincere and genuine, and doesn't come across as like
Villager outside of Dracula's castle.
yeah, like mind where you're looking, son.
But it's to make the critique, right? So the point of the ominous stuff is so that, it's obvious that there is a problem with the church sometimes hiding things.
Yeah.
Yes, it's to make that critique that like either they're deliberately hiding something or they just don't know what to do with it and they're trying to manage it.
Right.
And those are actually two different things. And that leads into a slightly deeper problem for me, which is when he has the follow-up conversation with Alan, and Alan's like, "Oh, did they get to you? Did they tell you to put it on a shelf? Did they? How high did they go? Stake president? Did the bishop? Like there's this vast conspiracy to tell you to shelf, like to not talk about blood atonement or something like that. That was, but again, like that ethnographically, it's like preposterous, but it's cracking good drama. Like it makes the show better, actually, to an outsider, I think.
I mean, like if HBO made a show about like the Catholic like sex scandals, and I'm not Catholic, and so I would need to be like hit over the head probably with certain things
Exactly.
for the context of it to make sense.
Yeah.
Even if it's
You can't afford ethnographic subtlety, or it's just going to go over outsiders' heads.
Yeah, because I don't understand the intricacies of how Catholic priests interact with each other or with their congregation, and so it needs to be a little bit.
I have no idea. I have no doubt that the play and the film Doubt does not ethnographically accurately represent the way that nuns and priests interact in the context of abuse accusations. It's a hell of a good drama, though.
Yeah.
It is very, very good. The other thing that I want to kind of shift into discussing now, and I don't know how much I want to get into this. I wrote my dissertation about, among other things, about the LDS endowment and about the temple more broadly. It was not an ethnographic description of the endowment itself, of what goes on in the temple. It was an ethnographic description of how Mormons talk about what goes on in the temple, including and especially all of the taboos, all of the sort of elliptical speeches, all of the euphemism. Like there's a code in Mormonism for how you talk about not talking about the temple and how you talk around the temple. And it's generated by this is part of what helps to understand why Mormons are not just going to bristle in a kind of like finger waggy way, but actually feel a deeply like internalized sense of violation when certain things about the temple are discussed with too much, or especially depicted, right, with too much accuracy or too much frankness. As an anthropologist, really any social scientist trying to publish anything about Mormons or any other tradition that has sacred rites or something like that, you have a very strong professional and academic ethical code that would make it that it would be a huge violation to sort of publicize things that your community does not want publicized, right? It would be a violation of rules that were guidelines that were given by your institutional review board. You could end up not having your dissertation published. It could be grounds for not being published in a journal or being published as a monograph by an academic press, or for even like losing tenure or something like that. I mean, these are very serious things. Those ethics are not the same as, say, journalistic ethics. They're not the same as storytelling ethics. They're not the same as the ethics of free speech and free enterprise, or not free expression. These are different sort of ethical frameworks that partially overlap. And we're looking at a really complex overlapping of these frameworks in the show, because the show is, to some degree, showcasing the effort that it's making to be accurate and to be respectful, to have consultants come in and make sure that things are done properly. And in the case of the temple stuff, it gets even trickier, because you could actually make I think a defensible moral argument that in the case of depicting something in the temple, that deliberately making it inaccurate makes it more ethical, because it doesn't show things. There are a handful of things in the temple that are just like completely verboten. The ceremony itself says, this is a thing here, do not disclose or talk about this, do not reveal this under any circumstances, right? So there's a little teeny percentage of what goes on in the temple is explicitly, categorically prohibited. There's also a pretty small percentage of what goes on in the temple that is explicitly, totally okay to talk about. Almost everything that goes on in the temple is in neither of those categories. That's a source of real power, actually. That's a big part of how we as a community generate our sense of the sanctity and the holiness of what goes on in the temple. You don't really know how to deal with most of that stuff. Almost all the ceremonial language is not in either of those categories, right? So you have there's a whole bunch of the ceremonial language of the temple. It's scriptural or scripture adjacent. It's authoritative. It is deeply meaningful, profoundly meaningful. It becomes the context for making covenants. Again, the covenants, it gets even trickier, because there are some parts of the covenants, like you made a covenant to obey the law of chastity. You can say that. You can't not say that. It's not a thing you can't say. But that covenant is in part reinforced by then making oaths to not disclose things that are directly connected to it. And it's messy. There's a kind of spillover. Again, if it were clear to everybody that you can talk totally freely about everything in the temple except these few things, it'd be completely different. But it's not. So in the absence of that clarity, most of that gray area is going to be much more heavily influenced by the prohibition at one end than the explicitly permitted stuff at the other end.
And I think a lot of this is governed by convention more than any
It means it has to be governed by convention. So conventions have to emerge in the community for how you talk about and how you don't talk about, and how you talk about not talking about the stuff that goes on in the temple. And these conventions are that's 100 pages of my dissertation is just talking about these conventions. How do Mormons talk around? And then how does that talking around generate? So what it means, for example, is if you've never been to the temple before, right? Like in my ethnographic research, I talked with seminary students. I talked with scholars of Mormonism who are not LDS. And one of the constant themes is that when people who care about Mormonism, whether as members of the church or not, when they are in the room, right? When they are present, when temple-initiated Mormons start talking about the temple, it gets real weird. It starts to feel, and they can't put their finger on why. It sort of feels like there's like an inside joke, except it's not, they're not in on, but it's also not funny. Right? And it's alienating for outsiders,
Yeah.
for like non-Mormon scholars. For the kids, though, it was mostly like it sort of enhanced their sense that like there's something very special there. Like you in a weird way, you start to be able to feel the holiness of the temple at a distance before you're even there, because you can feel something very palpable about the ways that people who have gone there and go there regularly, the way they talk about it, the way they don't talk about it, that there's a weightiness to all of that ends up feeling like a kind of gravitational pull. So by the time you get there, in a certain sense, you are preconditioned to experience the strangeness of the ceremony as something that's holy rather than just weird and alienating. I'm not saying nobody experiences it as weird and alienating, because presumably some people do when they go there for the first time. But you've already kind of been prepared to feel it in a certain way. In other words, part of what I'm saying in the dissertation is that we make the holiness of the temple outside of the temple, and then generate it more like that energy gets taken in, and then it gets reinforced inside the temple, and then it creates this kind of feedback loop between inside and outside. The temple is separate from the rest of the world. It's got strong borders and boundaries, but those borders are porous, and the holiness kind of leaves the temple, circulates in very constrained but very potent ways in the community. We have encounters with it outside of it, and then we bring our sense of what it is with us that comes from those encounters when we go in. Confidentiality, what I call in the dissertation structural silence, euphemism, elliptical speech, secrecy, prohibition, verbal taboo, these things all do enormous amounts of work in generating that sense of what's holy in the temple. All of which then means that for a Latter-day Saint who is still devout, and maybe even for a Latter-day Saint who's not particularly devout anymore, maybe doesn't go to the temple that much anymore, but is still heavily conditioned by years and years of experience there, seeing something that is technically a violation, is technically what's the word I'm thinking of here? That technically violates the sanctity of the temple actually feels powerfully like that. It's not just like, oh, well, that's technically not allowed, so that's terrible. No, like it feels like a violation.
But I think if you watch it closely, though, they don't technically violate anything.
No, I think it's weird I think you can make a technical case for the scene in this film that almost everything is technically in bounds.
Except for they show certain things but they're careful to have the voiceover of Sarah talking for parts of it, so that you're not actually hearing
what's being said.
Yeah, I think they were tried to be very circumspect and careful about that. And the one thing that I think is explicitly a taboo is, I think, the main thesis of showing the thing to begin with.
Right, which is showing what. So this is a situation then where, Dan and I have obligations as scholars and as Mormons to some degree, to be like very cautious and circumspect about how we talk about Dustin Lance Black talking about the temple. But one of the key moment in the temple is the depiction of this thing that's no longer even a part of the ceremony, right? So there used to be these penalties, there are things, there are covenants, they have associated tokens and signs, these gestures, things that are these are the things that are not to be disclosed, not to be revealed, and it also used to include a penalty, which was a sort of a gestural enactment of a violent form of death. The idea behind this was not, if you reveal this thing, this could be your punishment.
Well, I think originally it was that, at least when it was taken from Masonic ceremony. I think it was in 1930. One of the changes was
Yes.
to change from
So
this
they
is
used
what's
to,
coming to I would rather this happen than
yeah.
reveal.
So there are these two important historic developments. You can even say there's a third important historical development. The oldest one, which is that it's imported from. This is part of what's imported from Freemasonry, or penalties. Freemasons still use these penalties, by the way. They're still in their ceremonies, and they're still as gruesome. So before 1930, the penalties were enacted just as a gesture, right? Like you could gesture cutting your throat or having your tongue pulled out or something like that. And they were described in language. You know, they would say having my tongue pulled out by its root or something like that. In 1930, they changed it so that the descriptions of the punishments weren't there anymore. So they're only ritually, gesturally performed, and then in place of the language that says that describes them, it just says, "I would rather die than reveal these things." In other words, they wanted Mormons to see these acts of violence as things that you would be willing to subject yourself to before revealing. Like if I was being tortured to death, or if somebody was going to cut my throat or pull my tongue out or disembowel me, I would let that happen rather than reveal these things, right? And so that's the version of the penalties that would have been in the ceremony at the time of that's being depicted in the show. And then in 1990, all reference to penalties is removed. Right, so they're not there at all. So they depict a penalty, and it's a violent penalty. It's the penalty being depicted as, and they don't say this is Brenda ritually enacting the cutting of her own throat, right? So it's also kind of like dramatically effective that it's not over the top, that it's just kind of like you just sort of see this vague thing, and it's like, oh, that's creepy, you know. But I think Dan's onto something, that it does kind of get to the heart of why what is shown is shown.
And I think it's not an unimportant point to make that the significance was renegotiated long before, and so there's a different significance attached to that. And for folks who have never tracked down what it meant previously, the only meaning they know is whatever meaning they came up with, or they have developed an understanding of through their own research.
And it's also important here then, and Dan is going to go into this more, but it's important to note that this is juxtaposed with a voiceover of another character, the woman who's in the back of the police wagon, talking about blood atonement. And so again, the almost knock you over the head subtext of the juxtaposition of these two things in real time, where she's literally almost commenting on what you're seeing Brenda do, is that these things are connected to each other, that they're connected conceptually today, or at least in 1982, they're connected conceptually at the time, and because they're connected historically, which is not true.
And I wanted to read something actually that I found from an interview with Dustin Lance Black, where he kind of explains what he wants to get out of this series, at least in the context in which he said this. He says, sadly, it seems humanity has this instinct to go back to fundamentalist texts, whether it's the Constitution, ancient law, or the Bible, and to try to follow those texts word for word, thinking that's going to be the path back to happiness and abundance. Well, it's not true. The story is a cautionary tale to say that if you see a loved one, or if you yourself are stepping down a fundamentalist path, you are following rules that were written almost exclusively by men in a time when we did not know better. So you might want to ask yourself, who wrote these rules? Why did they write these rules? Who do they harm today now that we do know better? And don't we owe it to ourselves and our children to do better? When you know better, you can do better. That's the lesson of this true crime thriller. Stepping back into the fundamentalist religious text is saying that you're okay with a misogynist God, and I'm not okay with that. And I think this is an interesting statement about his thesis with the series, because I don't know what text he's talking about. Because he's not talking about the Bible. He's not talking about the Constitution.
Not talking about the Book of Mormon
Yeah,
or the Temple.
so far, there's only been one thing that was ostensibly from the Book of Mormon, and it was completely made up.
Yeah.
He's talking about John Taylor's Revelation, right? That's what the Lafferty brother says, is he brings up John Taylor's Revelation, the 1886 one.
I don't know if that's what Black's
Yeah, I
talking
don't know
about
that
here.
too.
Yeah, I don't know
It
what
was
the.
the only thing that I saw quoted from, like, early church leaders that was explicitly quoted throughout.
Yeah, and we'll see.
Yeah.
Have you seen all the episodes?
I have.
Okay, I thought you did. But we don't want. I know you're.
I didn't spoil.
Speaking of
Okay.
secrecy, you're probably actually under some kind of injunction
I
not
am,
to.
but I'm only talking about up to episode 3,
Right.
right? Yeah, so don't worry.
That sounds pretty fundamentalist to me.
I know.
But this is one of the reasons that I start with essentialism is because these texts can be read however they're meaningful to people, and they are read, they are renegotiated in light of circumstances, social identities, rhetorical needs, goals, things like that. And so I disagree with the notion that stepping back into the Constitution, the Bible, a fundamentalist religious text, means that you're going to discover whatever was initially intended for good or for evil. Because
And that you're going to be forced by integrity or something to adhere to that one true reading,
right.
even if it's out of sorts with modern ethics or something like that.
Because when the further back we go, the less and less likely we're going to have any idea precisely what it meant to begin with. Because texts do not carry any inherent meaning. We put the meaning on the text by reading it in light of what we need it to mean, what it would be helpful to us to mean, what it would be meaningful for us to mean. And so I see an essentialism in this thesis that I think is not only misrepresentative of how texts work just generically, but specifically texts that belong to what we label religion. But it strikes me as pretty close to one of the main theses of Krakauer's approach, which is set in a specific time period where it behooved him to represent the texts in a specific way because of contemporary events. And so, which is another, and that's another essentialist take. And so I think the nature of text and religious conventions and practice and liturgy and things like that are not being given a fair shake. But I don't have the benefit of having seen all the episodes.
No. So part of what we have to do is see how these things unfold.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of different ways I think we could frame this just looking at the episode at the series itself. One is you can actually see this process unfolding in the episode. So I almost have to backtrack. I mean, I really have to build on what I said before. I said there's no link between blood atonement and the penalty oaths in the temple, and there's not a historical link between those two things. One isn't historically, they didn't arise as sort of like representatives of one another or commentaries on each other or something like that. But if there are Laffertys or if there are radical fundamentalists in 1982 who are linking those two things together, then they are linked. And so again, Dustin Lance Black might be saying part of what's wrong with the Laffertys, part of what makes the Laffertys bad, and people like them bad, right? Extremists, anti-government extremists. What is the stock here? Part of what makes them bad is that they go and they look for ways of tying historical violence and violent texts, meaningful violent texts, to violent acts that they want to commit or something like that, right? So, and then you can see that there in contrast to Pyrie's invocation of another text. This isn't a written text, but it's an important kind of oral text, an important tradition in Mormonism. His invocation of that during the standoff when he's talking to the Lafferty brother in the cabin, and he tries to invoke Joseph Smith's unwillingness to escalate violence, and instead he surrenders in order to protect people and relies on God, right? So that like he's negotiating a contemporary meaning and a contemporary read of a historical text, a potent historical text here, away from violence, right? And then I think there's another really important moment here where Dustin Lance Black tips his hat, because the response from in the cabin is, well, that's Joseph. I'm a disciple of the Lion of the Lord, Brigham.
And Joseph is represented as taking the same tack. That's why he's brought up, because Joseph is the peacemaker in this one flashback. But then by the end of this episode,
he might be rethinking being a peacemaker.
Yeah,
because among other things, he wants to arm a militia, which he did in fact do in Nauvoo. He armed the militia. Now, what Joseph actually did and did not do with that militia, and what Dustin Lance Black portrays Joseph as doing or not doing with that militia, or are we'll see what happens there. But I suspect that it's not being set up to indicate that Joseph chooses violence, that Joseph chooses the path of Brigham, but rather that Brigham gets Joseph out of the way because he won't choose that path. So we'll see what happens there. But if that's the case, that's also, again, that's historically very inaccurate. But is it important for men like the Laffertys, who want to engage in certain kinds of violence and rationalize that violence in reference to powerful texts and powerful traditions, to see Brigham Young that way? The other thing I think that we should be keeping an eye on in this series is the relationship between arguably the two most important male characters, which are Pyrie and Allen, and this ongoing discussion, this ongoing sort of mutual interrogation that they're having, where all this stuff is being laid out. And Pyrie's periodically saying, hey, we're not asking me questions. I'm not the one being interrogated. But he is, right? And so the question is, how is that going to play out? These are the most sympathetic of the male characters in the show. Who wins that negotiation? Does Pyrie's insistence that this darkness and this horror, this blood, this violence is not Mormonism? Does he make that vision win out for himself, and is he able to continue to claim for himself, I am a good and faithful Mormon and I'm not a violent man? Or does Allen's claim that Mormonism breeds violent men win out, and does Pyrie end up feeling that the only way he can remain true to his commitment to not being violent is by abandoning Mormonism? Allen says to him, if you don't understand that these things are a part of Mormonism, you're not a very good Mormon. Okay? Does that turn out to be prophetic, or does that turn out to be a kind of feint on the part of an antagonistic character that ultimately, Pyrie's going to win by proving him wrong? And I think you'll be able to tell a lot about what's going on and what sort of the larger rhetorical purposes of the show are with respect to not just Mormonism, but religion in general, by how that negotiation plays out.
And go ahead.
Oh, just with the Brigham Young versus Joseph Smith thing, I was thinking, I actually really liked that as part of this episode. Like, maybe historically, I think it is inaccurate the way it's being portrayed, and probably will continue to be portrayed, like their relationship and their roles. But I do think that maybe the thesis of Joseph Smith was taking Mormonism down one route, and Brigham Young redirected that under his leadership, and maybe he took it down a darker route. Yeah, I think that would be a fair argument to make, even if it's historically, like factually, not true the way that they make it.
I mean, it's certainly not true that Brigham tried to get rid of Joseph Smith.
Right.
Was somehow implicated in the assassination or something like that. But it's certainly arguable that, and I think defenders of Mormonism would say maybe this was out of necessity, the vicissitudes of colonization or something like that. But that Brigham did. I mean, he moved Mormons from the edge of the frontier to the frontier, and from a space that went from being not violent to being quite violent to a space of sort of like disorder.
Well, and also from being a part of the United States and at least trying to occupy a little piece of it to being separated from a nation that they considered antagonistic, that alters the way you understand your boundaries
Yeah.
and perform them as well.
You're now independently sovereign.
Yeah.
You're now no and one of the subtexts of the way that Mormons in the 1950s, and we're going to talk a lot more about Mormons in the 1950s in the coming episodes, I promise. One of the subtexts of the way that Mormons understand their independence and their sovereignty is that they are looking at America that is on the cusp of just destroying itself over its own wickedness. Like they're not picking sides in the Civil War. They're just like this conflict that's brewing, that's coming up. Like the nation is like both sides are going to destroy themselves, and then the kingdom of God is going to flourish in its ashes. That they really believe that like they're never going to have to make peace with the United States again.
Do you have a comment in the back?
I thought the juxtaposition was more between Brigham and Emma rather than Brigham and Joseph.
Yeah.
The influence that, and then largely more like the influence women have on
Mhm.
the church rather than.
And who's Joseph going to listen to more between the two of them?
And that was more the influential and more the, I don't know, the drive of the episode.
That's a great point too, because again, and I don't know how accurate this is in terms of what actually went on with the Laffertys and with Brenda, but that comes in the same episode that finishes with Brenda saying, I'm going to reform these violent boys. I'm going to get them on the right path.
And I think overall too, like just seeing the role that the women play and the different women play differently in the different relationships is more of a spectrum than just, oh, this is what women do
Yeah.
in church versus, and even for the men too, I guess.
And you see that with the support versus the antagonism in the temple scene, where you have some of them
Women-
supportive of Brenda and the others are.
Yeah, you have the hushing scolds, but you also have the like, we'll talk to you, we'll talk you through this, we'll support you. We got to be sisters, we got to protect each other.
Yeah, and I wonder too if part of what they're trying to set up with Brigham is that they're going to take him to task about the colonization element
Mhm.
of things.
I'm almost certain they are, because I know one of the reasons why they essentially invented a Native
Well, I was
American
gonna say they cast
detective.
Gil Birmingham in the show, and he's an invented character, and I can't believe that it's just like a coincidence.
No, it's
They would
not. They
cast,
consulted
like,
with Paiute leadership to try to make sure that certain things about Mormon-Indian relations and the history
Right.
there were
And
accurate and fair. And
I know, like Krakauer, like one of like the premises of his book is that like Mormonism is inherently violent,
Mhm.
and so I would expect that they're going to want to explore like that angle of Brigham's actions
Yeah.
in Utah and how they impacted indigenous populations.
yeah, I expect the two big themes, with polygamy obviously being a part of the equation too, but the two big themes of Brigham's sort of reign of terror are going to be Mountain Meadows and Native American.
Right. See, so in that regard, like,
violence
it
against
doesn't really
Native
bother
Americans.
me that they're setting up like a kind of like historically inaccurate, I suppose, like
Yeah.
juxtaposition between Joseph and Brigham, because like I think Brigham Young was probably kind of a bad person,
Yeah.
and not someone I really like, and I don't really care how they're leading us there if it's in the like for this.
If ultimately it's depicting something important about who he
Yes,
actually
if
was. Yeah.
ultimately it's depicting the accurate thing that he like is kind of like the LDS Columbus or whatever, then like I'm okay with them fudging with the history of it, I think.
And then it comes to the question of, okay, so like if we're gonna go ahead and concede that there is a certain violence to Brigham Young, that there's a certain badness or darkness to Brigham Young, was he able to somehow either is his badness and darkness a kind of like natural extension of the badness and darkness intrinsic to Mormonism? Was he able to somehow embed that in Mormonism in such a way that it was going to inevitably come up later because extremists were going to dig it up and then start murdering people?
And this might be why they did the weird dog thing too with Joseph. Like that whole scene was so weird with the dog on the tree and whatever. But it does seem like they're showing Joseph as like less inclined
Toward violence.
Toward violence.
But I also felt like with that scene there was a subtext of like Joseph is the dog.
Yeah.
He's got a taste of young flesh, and
Well,
now he can't.
yes,
you know,
yeah, I mean,
like for the sort of the salacious side of things. Another connection I made this week that I don't know why I hadn't, but you know, it's only Brenda and the brothers that are involved in the killing that have their real names in the show. The other Laffertys, either their names are changed or they're even made up. I think one of them is also fabricated, right?
Sarah didn't exist.
What's that?
Sarah didn't exist.
And wasn't Rob? Is Robin also a made up character?
Yeah, Robin's also made up.
Yeah. So, but then they're taking a lot of artistic license with the brothers and father and stuff. And I can see reasons why they're doing this from a dramatic point. Like it's been so interesting to see the degree to which they're like making Ron a hero early, like a very relatable character early on. Spoiler: Ron is one of the murderers. But if you knew one thing about these murderers, it was that. But they named the father Ammon. And at first I was like, why pick like an obscure Mormon name that's not even that common in Mormonism for this dad when you're like depicting it to outsiders? And I was like, oh, took a while, but like that Lafferty's dad's name isn't Ammon, but Ammon Bundy's name is Ammon. It's like, oh, and then like again, the standoff with the Lafferty brother that they arrest. Nothing like that happened. You know, but it looked an awful lot like Ruby Ridge, right? So like taking these different and none of these extremist groups or like they're not all just like fundamentalists in the sense of just being polygamists or something like that. The Bundys aren't polygamists, so like it's sort of like taking sort of carving out like a generic like what Mormon extremists in these different guises. Are we essentializing Mormon extremism here, right? But like, I just, the name just like, it connected for me. Because in many ways, like the guy doesn't read at all like a Mormon dad. Ammon Bundy doesn't. Or, I'm sorry, Ammon Lafferty doesn't. But then again, neither do the Bundys.
yeah.
Except, the Bundys are, I think, still members in good standing. So it's like you can't just dismiss it. You can't say, oh well, they're not us, because in a certain sense they're not. Like most mainline Latter-day Saints don't think and act the way that the Bundy clan do. In fact, I know members of their extended family who can't stand them and hate when they show up at family reunions that are called Bundys, and they don't like they ruin family reunions whenever they show up. But
And I think
they still go to church, and they're still. I assume some of them have temple recommends.
And I think that raises an interesting point about how the church curates its own boundaries, because you whisper polygamy in the wrong parts. And,
What kinds of extremism are okay?
Yeah.
What kinds of extremism do we tolerate? Even if we don't embrace it, do we
Yeah.
tolerate it? And what kinds of extremism do we absolutely not tolerate? So militia type, anti-tax type, the kind of extremism that we're actually seeing in the depiction of the Laffertys, turns out we're still pretty tolerant of that.
Yeah, we have
Feminist extremism, or even not extreme feminism, right? Of the kind that we are seeing Brenda exemplify in the show, not nearly as tolerant of that. The threshold's much lower, you know. And so it's like, oh, well, you know, are these things historically accurate? Did Brenda really try to blackmail the producer at BYU TV or whatever? You know, like, I actually think that was kind of a shitty thing to depict her as doing. But not standing up for herself, but like the implication of the blackmail, I thought was pretty shitty. But having said that, you know, is it perfectly historically accurate? No. Is it fair? Are we in fact a lot harder on women like Brenda than we are on men like Ammon Bundy or Ammon Lafferty or the father figure in Educated? You know, are we like Mormonism does a pretty bad job dealing with crackpot dads, but has very little tolerance for feminist moms.
That is just one thing I was thinking throughout this episode is that one of the thesis, I know the thesis of the book definitely is that Mormonism or just religion in general is inherently violent, but
Patriarchally violent, makes men violent in particular.
Well,
yeah.
I was thinking that maybe part of the show, or maybe a potential thesis, is that it's not inherently violent. Mormonism isn't inherently violent, but it tolerates or it permits violence because it holds patriarchy above.
Because it cares more about protecting patriarchy than it does about keeping violence out of its ranks.
So most Mormon men might not be violent, but when there are violent Mormon men like Ammon, then that's allowed because we like patriarchy more.
And that's a much fairer criticism of Mormonism than just Mormonism breeds violent men.
Yeah.
It's a much fairer.
And that's a part of our scriptures that we not only still read but celebrate, depict, and make movies about the violence of other figures in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah,
And I,
Nephi chopping off his head. That you think about when you're like 5 or whatever.
Yeah, or like Yankum, I mean, like there's a lot of
and yeah, and go ahead.
I was just thinking that I don't see that there's a lot of, permitted violence within LDS culture in the way that the show depicts it, but the violence that we do see is, I think, really well described with like the bishop scene where you think that in real life they would play up more of the charm, the folks see the kindness, and it kind of brings the really common phrase, kill them with kindness, to more of a threat level than anything else, because even in fairly recent general conference talks I've heard, general authorities talk about the way that, we had wonderful relations with the Native Americans. We didn't butcher them like the rest of the people in America did. And when you look at what happened to the actual numbers and the people that lived here before, it's that thing where we're not violent per se.
Not all violence has to be hacking people to death.
Exactly, but there is a real violence there, and that's the same violence that we see utilized against people who against feminist proponents or people who are proponents of feminism or even like the queer community. It's that same kindness that comes to attack them.
And I think there's another really important scene in the film that sort of shows I think like accurately represents something about again what kinds of extremism, including violent extremism, we sort of tolerate or turn a blind eye to, and that's when Ammon is beating Dan, and then that turns to Ron kind of beating Ammon, and then these ladies drive by in the car that I couldn't tell who they were, if they were
Ward members.
just ward members, I thought, and they're sort of like, everything okay? And they're like, sure, and they're like, okay, just like, we'll leave it alone.
And this,
Absolutely no confrontation.
No getting out and saying, how dare you behave this way in front of the kids, even though that's what Ron is like. He's like, there are kids here, Dad, but then like he fights anyway,
And it's interesting. We have kind of conventionalized ideas about authorized and acceptable and even good violence, and I think they're playing with that a little bit in this show in a very subtle way as well.
I think something else that I found really fascinating about this episode was the one sister-in-law whose name I can't remember. She's kind of like newer in this episode, and how
The one who does most of the talking in the temple scene.
Yes, the one who's very much on the side of the Lafferty men and supporting this patriarchal system, and really this highlight of how there are plenty of women who enforce it, that play a role in the perpetuation of this, and it's almost a way of them claiming a sort of power. And I think one of the scenes that really distills that is when Brenda goes over to confront the brothers and all the women walk out of the room.
Yeah.
And the one like sister-in-law like undoes her husband's hair and just like fluffs it. It's like this like weird like sexual tension for a second. But it's like this whole idea of like, I'm getting a kick about allowing you to exercise violence against this other woman. And me giving you the space to do that is like, this is my place, and I gain power from that. It was a fascinating dynamic, like, and then thinking about like, okay, I've never had anything that extreme happen in my life, but where have I watched women in my life step back and allow me to become a victim of the patriarchy? and feel validated in that action.
A lot of people say that, and under patriarchy, the way it exists in Mormonism, and I'm sure in other contexts as well, that, women exercise a lot of soft power. But the dark side of that is that most of the soft power exercised by women in patriarchy is in upholding it and not resisting it.
Yeah, just a big notion in this episode was like, we obey the men, we obey the men, we obey the men. So you can reject that, or you can like get pride and be like, oh, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. And especially, I don't know much about this case or like where they're gonna take it or anything. I have no idea. But I just am waiting for not waiting, that sounds like I'm excited. It's horrible.
No,
But,
anticipation is
yeah.
definitely being built.
for some type of like discussion of sexual violence, or just because in that time where it's like, okay, you obey the man, it's like, okay, I want sex right now, like, okay, sure, like, but that's still rape, and so I'm just kind of waiting for that discussion, because that's violence, and I think that's a big part when we're talking about obedience in women.
And if that comes, it'll be in juxtaposition to the sexual relationship between Pyrie and his wife.
Because she's the one who
She's
tells
the one that
him.
gets to initiate.
Very odd conversation.
Yeah.
That was. Oh.
I mean, it was cringy, but it did introduce like I'm assuming is going to be an important dynamic in contrast to the dynamics that you'll see in the. I mean, even just him, like saying like, I want us to have babies and you to turn down the job. Like there's a sexual submission subtext. It's not just about like the subordination of career to family.
And I was disappointed with how they had Pyrie pull the priesthood card so flippantly with his wife after, because it was a way to say even this person we've set up as kind of the most relatable Mormon is still going
Who's maybe
to,
doubting things.
is still going to be a jerk to his wife if it gets him what he wants. And
I wanted to ask you guys about that scene. I couldn't tell what the subtext of his hesitation on the baptism was supposed to be. Was it supposed to be doubts because Alan is schooling him on the darkness of Mormon history or whatever? Or is it supposed to be like, I'm in a bad headspace because this is really fucking horrible stuff and I just like can't imagine baptizing my girls after coming home from work.
Why not both?
I
I feel like he put it forth ostensibly it's the second. Like he put forth to his wife that was the reason. Like, oh, this is just putting me in a bad headspace. But like for him personally, it's like, oh, like
maybe too early to telegraph that. Yeah,
I'm having doubts.
Yeah.
I don't think the character is conscious yet of doubts being there.
Right.
Yeah.
It's more like.
Well, I think the way he's going to the bishop and in the
anticipation.
shower, he's talking about,
Yeah,
maybe this isn't coming from outside, maybe this is, and I forget the way he said it, like bones sticking up out of the desert or something like that, where it's very clear that he's reconsidering, or at least he's worrying about this.
Yeah.
And so
And that the bishop didn't help him by saying to shelve it.
right, he played the role of the authoritative, I better not hear any more of this out of you. And similar to the role that the ordnance workers played, where they were sitting there wagging their fingers.
That was accurate to me.
They are instructed not to do that kind of stuff. But the sense I got was that was the rationalization that he was entertaining these doubts, and that was something he was doing to kind of keep things at arm's length. But
But I think.
But then he'll play the trump card of priesthood holder too in the same
Yeah,
sentence.
Like there's a big divide across between someone like having some doubts and still just like going along with things and still participating fully in the religion, and like getting to the point where they can like vocalize out loud, I'm not sure if any of this is true actually.
Right. In fact, for a lot of people, I think it's
we got
years.
4 episodes.
We only got 4 episodes left.
And like 8
But
days.
he's gonna have to see some disturbing shit in those 8 days. So maybe it'll get sped up for him.
I also think there's a big trope especially when men are telling stories of patriarchy, to use young girls and daughters as,
Yep.
the paragon of
And pretty
purity.
girls too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like casting a very pretty actress.
Yes, very young, white, usually blonde. But the young girl is usually what helps the hero see the
The problem,
wrongness
yeah.
of what's
Corrosive
happening.
influence.
Oh, I mean, they
And if-
literally did the thing of like he's watching her, and then he like flashes to his daughter.
Yeah,
You
and
know?
if the director has already
She's
come out
somebody's
and said
daughter.
that, like, patriarchy is a big part of like the fundamental text of LDS culture,
Mhm.
then that's absolutely going to be.
Yeah, when he says misogynistic God, he does mean the God of Mormonism, I think. And it's you know, like how much can you legitimately push back against that?
Given the structure.
You know. Any other questions before we wrap up or comments? Anything from online here? I mean, I'm sure there's some questions.
More
but
comments than questions.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up. That's a good time for this week. And next week we're going to talk. I'm pretty sure we're going to talk a lot more about the 1850s, Mormon Reformation, Mountain Meadows, that kind of stuff. And you know, if anything else comes up, we'll see it in the episode.
Yeah, I think the Great Reformation. There was a question about the Great Reformation, and yeah, I think that's going to be. I assume that's going to be central to discussing Brigham Young's role.
I mean, the Mormon
clamping
Reformation is
down.
the context when blood atonement really becomes like a thing, and to some degree, the end of the Reformation also when it becomes less of a thing. But so that'll sort of, I think, end up being the bridge between these episodes, especially with. I don't know when they're going to depict. Like, are they doing if they're doing the history relatively chronologically, then they still got novel polygamy and secrecy that I know they're going to hit. They still got to do the assassination. They got to, and then so does that mean the Mountain Meadows isn't till episode 7? or are we going to get it?
That could be
that could be the
climax.
trajectory, but the context of blood atonement means that it would be good to go into Mountain Meadows and the lead up to Mountain
We'll
Meadows.
just have to see.
Tune in for a very special episode of Where Blood Atonement.
There is one question someone brought up,
Mhm.
the whole thing about fornication,
Yeah.
which was weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
It's an actual fundamentalist belief, and I think
That's what I wondered. Is
yeah, it's kind of hard to see if you're like a mainstream Latter-day Saint, but like there are certain groups, especially the Crossfield group, that believe that fornication was disobeying a priesthood authority.
in particular your husband, or not even
Any
necessarily?
priesthood authority, but I mean the hierarchy for them would be husband, not prophet first.
I mean, there is like a weird thing from.
well, you can go back to the Bible for that. Hosea uses fornication and adultery as the metaphor for
disloyalty to
disloyalty to Adonai and worshiping Baal and things like that. It's a pretty short
cheating
connection.
on your
Yeah.
That's still weird for us, right?
Yeah.
It is.
And so maybe that's one of the consultation with members of fundamentalist groups bubbling to the surface there. So one of the ways that they were trying to signal fundamentalism, and we were like, that's stupid. I don't know.
Well,
watching it is weird, right? Because I spent a lot of time with fundamentalists, but then I like just see these things and I'm like, oh, we're just like missing the point. Like the historical inaccuracies are the way that fundamentalists sometimes view history, right?
Right.
Like, that's their portrayal of history, and you know, I still think it's inaccurate, but like the point of it is to show what the laughter is.
Well, and then I wonder if the fundamentalists also feel like they're being that if what's being depicted as a fundamentalist sociology or fundamentalist history or something like that, then is it fair? In other words, are the
Moroni Jessup's blog?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is good. It's the punk rock polygamist.
Yeah.
I think
I know who Moroni is. So has he been blogging about the
Yeah,
series?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to get a take of whether or not this is actually a realistic.
If you want, like two diverse takes, Moroni Jessup and then Benjamin Schaefer.
Mhm.
Very different takes.
And they both come out of fundamentalist communities.
Yeah, Benjamin Schaefer is the righteous branch of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then Moroni is former AUB, but is independent now.
Okay.
Are they both former fundamental?
No, they're both still fundamentalists, right?
Yeah, so Moroni is a current fundamentalist. He's
Okay.
just independent, and he's a former polygamist. Benjamin Schaefer is current. He's a 70 in the righteous branch.
Okay, because I imagine fundamentalist Christian group or Mormon groups, their experiences have to be just even more idiosyncratic
Oh, sure.
than ours, and so it's going to be even harder for them to try to resonate with different groups.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Crossfields group is mostly dissipated, except for there's like one dude who His name is Jason, who still runs it.
Jessup.
Moroni Jessup.
Moroni Jessup.
And am I correct? The history's a little jumbled in my head, but the Laffertys had only been involved in this for like a year or two. Isn't
Yeah, so
that
they
accurate?
started joining in 1982. They joined the Crossroads group.
So and within 2 years, that's why their beards aren't as long as.
Yeah. Exactly.
They were.
Do fundamentalists have temples?
Some of them do.
Some of them do.
Okay.
Yeah. And in which case, this is another important subtext here. If there are fundamentalist temple ceremonies, they almost certainly still are going to include those older
Yeah,
things
Benjamin
that.
Schaefer wrote about it.
Yeah.
That's why I recommended him, because he wrote about the penalties, because he still does the penalties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Probably the pre-1930 version, right?
If anybody didn't hear that watching on the YouTube live stream, Moroni Jessup and Benjamin Schaefer, two fundamentalist Mormons who have written in response to the show. And were they at the screening? Have they seen all the
So they've seen all
episodes?
the
Okay, so
They've seen the first two. They haven't seen all of them.
haven't seen all of them.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they didn't get the.
But Moroni consulted. with-
Oh, consulted.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So look for their blogs for responses from fundamentalist communities.
Super random historical question. So they kind of infer that the attempted assassination on Governor Boggs, which they frame as like a successful assassination, was by a member of the church. They seem like to kind of be hinting at what's his face.
Rockwell.
They are,
Yeah.
and it
Is
was.
there any basis for that?
Yeah, it's not certain that he did it, but it was pretty widely believed that he did it, and it wasn't clear whether if he did it, he was acting sort of on his own accord, or whether Joseph had put him up to it.
And when you see it, he's like, "Bam!" And I was like,
Yeah.
"That he lived."
Yeah.
And I went and looked it up, and it was like he
And
kind
it was
of.
bird shot too, or butt
Yeah,
shot.
yeah. He got hit like in the neck and like in the
Yeah.
jaw and stuff like that. So he actually did get hit right in the back of the
Yeah.
head. But yeah, they made it look like he blew him to pieces. So
I don't think it's clear historically if he was the one that did it, but I think it's clear that at the time it was widely rumored that he was involved, and speculated again about whether Joseph was involved or not. And I think part of the reason why there were people trying to arrest Joseph in Nauvoo to extradite him to Missouri was not just because he had escaped from jail and run away or whatever, but also to try him as a conspirator in an assassination attempt on Boggs. Okay.
all right. Well, thank you so much for coming. We
Take care,
appreciate
guys.
Your input.
Please clap.
And thank you everybody following along
I
on
want
YouTube.
HBO to do a good show about Porter Rockwell.
There's no way to figure out the.
They could-
The actual.
Yeah, they could make a cool Western show
Yeah, we need to
about
get lunch.
that.
because
Yes.
honestly, you have so much heated over me.
It's not exciting. Well, it is exciting.
Oh,
It's depressing.
Thank you.
I'm stuck.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
for coming, guys.
I think
Come
some
back.
academics live in like this weird in between the things we find exciting.
Oh, you have a hole in your